Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of vBrownBag. Tonight, we are continuing on our series on REST API, and this evening, I'm very excited to be we have Kyle Ruddy tonight, and he's talking about APIs in PowerShell, something that is near and dear to my heart, so I'm very excited to have him on. A couple of housekeeping notes. Please get in on the conversation. I will be monitoring both the internal conversation in the webinar and Twitter via hashtag vBrownBag and at vBrownBag. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to pop a question in either form, and I will ask them of Mr. Ruddy. With that, let me turn the power over to you, Mr. Ruddy.
Sweet. Thank you very much.
Shablam, you have the power.
Ooh, scary.
No, don't hit end. What?
Oops, wrong button. All right. So
nice. I can see your screen.
You can see my screen. Okay, so you see a blank slide right now.
Click to add title. Yes.
All right. All right. So let's actually get started here and start talking about some cool stuff. So, you know, as we've seen so far in this series, which I have been thoroughly enjoying, we saw pretty much an overview of what RESTful APIs are. And, you know, I was kind of lucky enough that Chris Wall went through and he's done, you know, most of my sessions for me already. He gave a nice little sneak peek for me. So, and then from there, we kind of built out and then started including, you know, how to consume that with programming languages. And, you know, that presenter kind of threw a little barb at PowerShell in that one, which was highly entertaining. And then we saw RESTful APIs and, you know, how you can use them on certain products. So one of those I did was doing that with vSphere. Another one was Jad talking about VRA. John Diaz did VROps last night. There's been, you know, several across the board as we've been going. So now we're going to take it a little step further and, you know, start talking about how we can consume these. So we've seen, you know, how to view these APIs, how to, you know, kind of start interacting with them through things like the Swagger interfaces, like the API Explorer, and Postman, which is another really great tool. But what if you want to start, you know, combining multiple calls into one and really start doing some stuff? So tonight we're talking about PowerShell, and we're not going to get into the whole debate about whether or not it's a programming language, because that's more of a religious debate. Everybody has their own preference and whatnot. So skipping over that, let's start talking about what you need to have. So bare minimum, to get started consuming RESTful APIs with PowerShell, you do have to have PowerShell version 4 or better. Now, this is one thing that I should also mention, because technically PowerShell Core is still a beta at the time of this session. However, I believe the latest and greatest version that they released, either sometime late last week or sometime earlier this week, actually starts to include the commandlets that we're going to be using tonight. However, I don't have the right version of OS X and don't have the time to go through and actually update my system. So I'll be doing everything in a Windows system, and I'll be using PowerShell 5.1. So from there, we're going to need to get familiar with a couple of these commandlets. So first and foremost, invoke web request. So that is going to be something that is literally pretty much doing the same thing as what we were seeing in Postman and the API Explorer. So you're going to get the entire response back. So you're going to get the body, you're going to get the headers, you're going to get the status codes, you're going to get everything. And then there's also invoke REST method. Now, when you do this, you're only going to get back the content. So that's something that you have to kind of take into consideration. And I'll be talking about some of the performance considerations that are involved in these as well. And then the last one that really makes your life easy, especially as I'll be going through some of the examples tonight and taking a look at the vSphere APIs, since that all, you know, everything that you do to submit to the API endpoint is through JSON. So being able to format your code or your input easily within PowerShell through a hash table, and then converting that over to JSON in a simple, pipeline, just makes everybody's life easier. So those are the three ones that you're going to need to know, or really, we're going to find out how to use tonight. So with that, let me jump over into into my lab system here. So tonight, one of the first APIs that we're going to start interacting with is swapi.co. Now, the full version of this is the Star Wars API. So that's kind of a cool one to just, it's openly available. You can use PowerShell and start pulling stuff back, and it's kind of interesting, to see some of the people, some of the planets, and so forth. I've got a, oops, there we go. Go back to this. So I've got the root of the API open here. So it just did a get method against it, and we can see kind of the subsections from that point. To kind of show how this works here, we can then go to let's do people. And I'm just as an FYI, I am doing this from a hotel. So if things are looking a little slower, that is why. So here's there's at least there's 87 people that are listed within this API. And the first one is Luke Skywalker. Gives you some interesting tidbits about him, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so that's going to be the first one that we're going to take a look at. So let's dive in here. So I'm using Visual Studio Code. It's been my go-to ISE here lately. Especially nice that it works cross-platform, so I can have it on my Mac system as well as on my Windows systems, and it works pretty easily and straightforward. So first, we will start off using invoke REST method. It's pretty simple. So let me just type that in there. Oops. So invoke REST method. You see some of our actually here, let's just do a get member. Oh, that did not work at all. It wants all the information. All right, so anyways. Going through some of these, checking out the parameters. So we see method. This is your get, post, delete, so on and so forth. Use basic parsing. The URI, which in this case is going to be the URL for that endpoint. Session variables, credentials. We'll get into credentials when we get to the vSphere side of things. Using certificates, and there's quite a few options here. So let's just start off with just doing a very simple invoke REST method, calling that the URI or the URL for that top level root of the API, and then doing a get. So in this case, do an F8. Unless it's broken form, there we go. All right, so we've performed that. Check out what the response is here. So we can see that using invoke REST method, we get exactly the body of what we saw before. Now, doing a similar thing, let's change this into invoke web request. Which, Chris, can you read everything on my screen okay?
Yes, I can.
The output? Okay, good deal. All right, so now we just did invoke web request on the same thing. Now we see our status code, we see our status description, we see the content. So that the content is the body, and then we see the raw content, the headers, and so on and so forth. Now, kind of the one really nice thing about being able to do the invoke web request is that you get back that status code. So if you're building in any kind of error handling into your PowerShell scripts or your functions, you can do, in essence, status checks against that, because as we've seen throughout the series, just because you make an API request doesn't always mean that you're going to get a response. So that's kind of another way to verify that something has happened and it's happened appropriately. However, so with this one, we can then dive in further with our parameters here, or not parameters, but other information here. So we can specify the content. So now we can see pretty much everything in the body there. Now we can also make use of convert from JSON. And now we can see,
cool.
That nice area of the body there. So that's kind of a breakdown of, really simply calling out to an API and then showing the difference between invoke REST method and invoke web request. From that point, it's pretty much your call as far as, the creator of the scripting resource or creating of the function as to, which one works best for you and what you're trying to do. So let's move forward here. Let's take a look at some of the other sections here. So let's take a look at species. Let's run that guy. Oh, is unhappy with me. What did I do? Oh, that's because that was set up for invoke REST method. Let's update our variable there. I'm looking for the dot species, and that does not exist on the other one. I would have to do dot content, then convert from JSON, and then call species. Oh, that reminds me. I should show you what I'm actually calling here. So API root, again, shows us this. So since this is a hash table, we can do API root.people, and then we get out that URL or URI of where that, where would we be specifying, our target. So the same thing for films. So when we do the next call here, here, F8. No, you really want me highlighting that. Okay, there we go. So now we can check out the species API. There's a bit more information here with this one, but it's still extremely similar to what we saw before on the web page. So in this case, we can see that there are 37 species. And I should also mention that this is, all by design of the API. So, not every API is going to be interacted with the same way. So if we move over to like VRA's API and we do something similar, it's not going to have a count there. That has to be written into the API itself, into how you consume that API. So in this case, we will actually want results. Here, I'm skipping by my planned lines here. All right, so we just did species. So we called out our species API, which is when we brought back in, we made that GET request against the Star Wars API.co API, then species. However, now we're grabbing out just the results. So we're doing calling that species API, we're doing a pipeline into select object, and then using the expand property parameter on the results property. So we're just saying we just want the results. So calling species now, this bottom one, oops, there we go. So the very last one in the list is a species by the name of Doug. and then we can see some more information about the Doug species. So here, let's do a get random here and find something else. So now we've got an Ewok. You can see information about that, and then we can continue drilling down here and make other API calls against it. So in this case, let's do a select object, expand property, and let's do home world. It'll be a get method. Then we'll do our invoke REST method, URI. And we can see that the home world is Trandosha. We can see other information about that. So you can kind of continue drilling down with this and kind of having a little bit of fun while you're also learning how to use PowerShell and interacting with a RESTful API. So let's move over to vSphere. So here, let's clear this. So we're going to be doing something very similar to what we did in my previous session, where we're kind of playing with the RESTful APIs. Now, when we were doing this in Postman and when we were doing this in the API Explorer, the first thing was that you had to figure out what your vCenter server was and then authenticate. So in this scenario, we're going to be, again, using the vCenter server that's vCSA01. Let's run that. And then we have our authentication. So the vCenter automation, RESTful APIs, excuse me, it uses basic authentication. So don't feel the need to reinvent the wheel or anything here. This auth string and the header information here, this is all something that I found from online. So feel free to make use of that. It makes life much easier instead of having to try and figure out how to exactly formulate this. We're going to go through and set up our authentication here so that we're ready to join that. So
VMware one. Wait, what? I'm sorry.
Pretty much, yeah. So let's make sure that we've got some stuff here.
Oh, Graham's asking, do you need to do an auth if you have Connect VI server done?
Yes. Yes, you will. So if you put it into PowerCLI terms, so Connect VI server has one way to connect in. These are doing something, what we're doing here is very similar to what you would do if you were using the Get CIS server, or rather it would be Connect CIS server and then Get CIS service. It would be very similar to this, but we're kind of taking out PowerCLI as the easier interface there. So PowerCLI kind of reduces a lot of the complexity around doing this. However, at the same time, you're using PowerCLI-based commandlets and not invoking straight REST calls, if that makes sense at all. But yes, to answer the question, you will indeed have to re-authenticate. However, with that, once you authenticate the one time, you can continue using it until it times out. I want to say the timeout period for vCenter in 6.5 is it's either 10 or 30 minutes. I was using it for quite a while last night, so I want to say it's 30 minutes. So again, we've got our head variable there. It's kind of broken that down into the formatting that we need. So then now we can go through and do our invoke web request against the CIS session. So that's the exact same method we were using in Postman to do that. Let's go ahead and run that. Then if we take a look at that, so we can see again, this is using invoke web request. So we see the full value, or the full response, I should say. So we have a value here within our content. Now that is what's known as our token. So we're going to take that token and we're going to convert it from JSON, and we want to store just that value because we kind of have to reformat that and assign it to the VMware API session ID to use that going forward as our authentication. That's how we basically authenticate in with every single API call that we do. So now token is just literally calling out just this value right here. Oops, just that value right there. So we've used our PowerShell magic there to pull out that information. And then from there, we'll get our session variable.
Oh, what's the minimum version of vCenter required?
So all of the RESTful APIs for vSphere is vSphere 6.5.
Gotcha, thank you.
And if you happen to be one of those folks that are involved in the VMware on AWS instance, that also works within that service too. Cool. And it works exactly the same way that we're using it here. So there we've got our session, we've got our token value, we've got that assigned properly to the VMware API session ID. Now we can actually start doing stuff. So last week we started off talking about, actually I'm gonna have to redo that because I don't think my user has rights to that one. All right, so let's redo this. Sorry about that. To switch over to the administrator at vSphere.local account. It's a test lab. All right, so we've got that. Then we need to do our authentication here again. Got that. Now we can do our calling out to our vCenter server, checking out the appliance, looking at the access methods, and then specifically looking at SSH. So we've made that call. This is the same thing that we were seeing in the API Explorer from before. We've made our call, so let's take a look at what our SSH get request variable now looks like. We see that we've got our status 200. We can see that our value is set to false, which basically means that SSH is not currently enabled. And then we can make it pretty. So like if you were trying to return this from a script or you were trying to return this from a function, we can do, again, our convert from JSON, pulling out that content and then specifying just the value. Now, if we do an SSH get, we can see that we just get out false. Now, what if we wanted to change that? So let's make sure that, oh no, we aren't changing it yet. We're going through and we're going to view this in invoke REST method. So we're changing it from the invoke web request and now only doing it with invoke REST method.
I have a feeling that this is going to be the most paused vBrownBag episode ever.
And I will be sharing these when it's done.
Oh, awesome. Okay, good.
I will definitely add that or have you add that into the session notes too.
Awesome. Thank you, sir.
So just like we were doing with the Star Wars API, where we're using the exact same parameters, we're just switching it from invoke web request over to invoke REST method and change nothing else. So now we're going to run our, that's because I didn't highlight it all the way. Attach our $sign there to pull back our variable. So now we can see that we're getting just the content back, just the body. So to get the exact same thing as we were getting from above, just calling out SSH, our variable there, and then specifying the value. So now let's talk about speed. So, because when you're working with APIs, well, really, when you're doing anything automation-wise, you should be aware of how long it takes to do a process, and then if you can, optimize. So in this scenario, we're using measure command and then putting that in a script block and comparing the invoked web request and invoked REST method. Let's run our top one here. And we can see here that it took 167 milliseconds.
Cool. I'm going to start using measure command now.
See, even if you're learning other things about PowerShell.
I did not know that existed. I'm very excited about that.
Then if we do the invoke REST method.
Oh, wow.
We're only talking a difference of about 20 milliseconds, but invoke web request was actually faster. So even though it's pulling back a ton more information, invoke REST method was oh wait, actually, no, it's even worse.
It's a second faster.
Yeah, it's 1 second in 20 milliseconds slower. Mm-hmm. So take that into consideration when you're building out your scripts and your functions, because maybe it's only a second, but if you're applying this to a VM and you've got a couple hundred VMs, that's a couple hundred seconds that you could have back in your life. Okay, so now we've done a couple gets. We've seen some performance interaction, and I should also say that this is not the same. If I was doing this against the Star Wars API last night, and invoke, I think it was invoke REST method was actually faster than invoke web request. They switched, so that's also another use case of knowing your API. So now we're going to modify some stuff. Now we're going to take another look at our SSH, and then we're going to enable it. So we're setting up a hash table here, and then we're setting enabled to be true. So if we go back over here to our API Explorer, and we zoom in here a wee bit, we'll go over to our appliance, and we will go to access and SSH. We can see that this is what it's expecting. So this is the parameter that the REST endpoint is expecting to come into it. So this is what we have to make within PowerShell. So that's where the enabled equals true comes from, and then we're using convert to JSON to take that hash table and turn it into JSON. So let's highlight that section and run that. So now if we look at our SSH set request body, you can see that it is now JSON formatted, and it looks exactly like what our API Explorer documentation is telling us that the endpoint is looking for. So now we're going to do a put, because again, if we, oops, wrong window there. Going back to our API Explorer, we can see that the method that the endpoint is expecting is a put. So we're going to have to replicate that within PowerShell. So, we've got our URI there, which is the URL to the API endpoint. We're remaining it at SSH because our documentation didn't say that we needed to change that. Our method is put. We already checked that part out. Headers remains the same with session. And we're feeding it in a body. That's a new parameter, and that's what we're giving it as part of that's the JSON that we just created. And then the last part that you do have to include is telling the API endpoint what kind of content that it's being sent. So in this case, it's application JSON. And if you're using something that uses something else, that's where we got that information from. So in some of the other vSphere APIs, it does XML. Actually, I shouldn't say vSphere. NSXV uses XML, and then so on and so forth. So kind of know your content type when you're making these. Otherwise, you could get some errors. So let's highlight this and do an F8 there to run that. So if we take a look at our SSH set request variable here, that's pulling back the response. So we can see that we have a status code of 200. However, the content here is empty. So, if you were doing this and you were just, expecting this to return back to either your PowerShell session or within a script, you're not going to get any information back. So this is where having the status code available kind of comes in handy. Okay, so we've done that. Now we need to verify. We need to go back and check and make sure that it actually did change it. That I'm not just using smoke and mirrors here. So we do the same get method that we did previously, and then we can recall our variable there. And so now we can see we have a value of true, which let's verify before. So our previous output was false, and now we're receiving a true. So we can basically estimate that the SSH condition has changed. So that now we have enabled SSH, and if you need to, for whatever reason, to SSH into your vCSA, because we are doing this against a vCSA, that now works, and you successfully changed a setting now with PowerShell through a RESTful API. So let's move on to let's do some interacting with the environment itself. Go a little bit past just playing with the appliance side. One of the other things that I went through in the last session was interacting with the host. So in this case, we're going to do something very similar. So it's going to the vCenter, to the REST endpoint, then we're calling vCenter and host, and then doing our get method, and then storing that into a variable. Run that. And if we check that out, we can see the content up here. So we can see the value. We've got a host 123, which is ESX01, connected, powered on. There's a host 02, and then it so on and so forth. So let's look at this in a little bit of a nicer view. Something like you would expect to get to receive back from. Oh man, I am not doing good at the double clicking there. There we go. All right, so we've taken that output. We've specified that we just want the content property. We're converting from JSON that content property, and then we're only receiving back the value, and then this is what we're getting back. So what we see here on the screen is pretty much the pretty version of what the API endpoint fed back to us. So now let's interact with one of these hosts. So the one that I was using before, it was ESX04. So let's continue using that. So we're going to set our host ID here, and it's just a string for 167. We're going to do a disconnect. So we're just calling out in the same URI from the API Explorer, from the documentation. We're doing a post. Actually, let's just get some information back about the host before we go actually playing with stuff here. So do a invoke REST method. Do the URI here to be HTTPS vCenter RESTful endpoint, then vCenter, then host. Then we'll call out the host ID. And if you're, kind of sort of new to PowerShell, I should mention which quotes you use matter. So if double quotes are going to spit out the information that's contained with that, except it's going to switch out the variables for the actual values therein. If you use single quotes, it's going to do it just exactly as it's written. So just a heads up about that in case you're running into something weird. Then I need to stop looking above there because we're doing a get. We're not changing or updating anything. What did I mess up here? vCenter, REST, vCenter, host ID. Here, let's just copy out this. Oh, maybe it was no, I shouldn't have to have that. Interesting. Well, live demos, fun. Let's see if our
it was going too well. Something had to happen.
Oh, true. Very, very true. I was hoping that just my my highlighting capability was all that was going to go wrong here. Oh well, I could have been making up an API call that didn't exist because it kind of looked like the disconnect worked.
Nice. That run section that you're using in VS Code, is that built in, or was that a plugin that you had to add?
So that is new with probably not the latest version, but I think the version before that. So that was definitely one of the things that VS Code was missing.
Yeah.
Being able to interact with a terminal, kind of like the PowerShell ISE has.
Mm-hmm.
And then once it enabled that, I mean, it was kind of a no-brainer in starting the migration from the ISE over to VS Code. So much nicer.
Nice.
Yep. So that looks like it worked. So I may have been making up an API call that didn't exist. So now we can see we got a 200 back. This is another one of those calls that there's nothing in the content, so nothing was returned. So let's do another get against our hosts. Since I did not do anything, I did not set myself up to succeed in just scrolling down on this one. So let's do an F8 there on that one, convert everything and make it look pretty like. There we go. So now we can see ESX04 is now disconnected when it used to be connected. And then let's do our, now what, we've got 10 minutes left. Let's we've lived pretty dangerously so far. So let's do a delete. So same kind of deal, except this is using the one that I made up. Apparently the get doesn't exist, but the host ID section does. Not like I don't have the API Explorer on another browser window. I'm apparently just too stubborn to go look at it. So let's do a delete. So we've got information about the hosts that are connected or that are attached to this vCenter. We've now taken one of the hosts and disconnected it, and let's remove it. No, maybe I did make up that call. All right, so we are going to use the documentation here. Demo is going sideways. All right, so let's go down to our vCenter, then look at our host. Oh, it's delete. I think I was doing a post. Right? I did a post, yep. But this is supposed to be a delete. All right, let's run that again. And then on the last time that we were doing this, I think Ariel was on, and he made a comment that, you know, there's no like confirm with this. You know, none of these commandlets have asked me to confirm that I indeed do want to do this. So, you know, take that into consideration as well when you're doing this, because, you know, if you're doing this against prod, hopefully you've used a test environment, or, you know, you've done this in one of the hands-on labs that VMware offers, or, you know, something, you know, whatever your test bed is, you know, play with that before you get anything too crazy. Let's see, system string not permitted. That probably means that it didn't return anything. Yep. So it can't convert something that's in content, especially by the value property, if it doesn't exist. So we can see again, this is another 200. You know, it's not there, it's gone, it's missing. Let's do another get. Convert it and make it pretty. Oops. And now we can see that ESX04 does not exist anymore. Now we're going to get into one of the fun parts, which is trying to add it back. So very similarly to what we did previously with SSH, we now have we now need to fill out a hash table and fill it with the information that's required to add a host. Again, by checking out our documentation over here. Where's here? The post here. So we can see that there's a specification parameter or a spec that's required, and then there are these values that are within here that we just need to fill out and submit in. So we see a very similar thing. Pretty much the big ones are which folder should it live in, and then host name, username, password. Everybody loves VMware 1 exclamation point. And then doing a do not verify the thumbprint, because this is a lab, there's no SSL host or SSL cert on this host. So now we will do another post, and we're specifying the body. And then it looks like I did not specify the input there. So content type, that is application JSON.
Oh, quick question. Does running REST API show up in the recent tasks in vCenter or under the tasks and events?
I would love to say yes to that, but let's verify.
I was thinking the same thing. I was like, I'm pretty sure it does, but I'm not 100%.
I mean, underneath the covers, everything that's happening is running an API on the back end. So let's see if we've got our if the tasks are still Still active, hasn't been flushed. Yep. Okay, so we've got our disconnect there, we've got our remove, and then if you remember, I did switch it over from my user account, my kruddy at corp.local, and switch it over to the local SSO administrator so I can do some stuff to the VCSA. So everything is as expected, and just like you would expect if you were doing this live within your environment through the UI or through PowerCLI or something. So let's run this guy and hope that it works. Actually, nope, we're not ready to run that yet. We need to put in our body input there. Let's run that section. You see that it was put in as a hash table, and now that we're seeing it, it's been converted to JSON, so it looks exactly like what it's expecting from the documentation. Let's run this, run our next line, and cross our fingers. So, and you can tell from that, by the wait there that these calls are synchronous. So it was literally waiting for something to happen, for something to succeed. So in this case, we can see that we have a 200, which is saying everything is good. You can see a value there with a host of host 183, which is the MoRef. And then if we go back to our UI here, we can see that a standalone host has been added. It's gone right there to the root of our cluster, or not our cluster, but our data center. And if one of the questions comes up, can you add it to a cluster directly through the API? That is not yet available, but that is very high on the priority list. So there we go. We have our example done there. We can see that everything was added in properly. Let's do another get against our hosts. Verify that the API is seeing that properly. We've done our request. We'll kind of pretty up the output there. And we can now see that our host 183 MoRef is ESX04, and it's connected and powered on. We've pretty much run the gambit of deleting something, changing something, and now we've added something back in. Lastly, since we have about 2 minutes left, we'll get into kind of okay, so now that you can do these calls, let's actually make something of it. So let's create a function. So we've done a whole bunch of things around interacting with VM hosts. So let's keep that going. So we have our standard function framework, or skeleton here. So I put in some information because everything needs documentation. Everything that you put in should have some form of documentation. Just a little like, what is it? What does it do? Who made it? So you have somebody to blame or curse when it doesn't work in your environment. It doesn't mean that they're going to support it, but at least you can curse them and make pincushion dolls and curse them that way. Add in some parameters. So in this case, we're not going to assume that somebody has already authenticated. If somebody's going to go through the work of using a function, we should probably build in the authentication piece as well. So this is where we're combining a couple different calls into one. So we have vCenter, username, password, and/or credential. And then we've got a little example here, just saying, this is what we would expect somebody to be able to use to successfully pull back information within their own environment. This is all pretty standard. If you haven't used VS Code, this is the script analyzer. It's saying, hey, you should probably not use this as a string. You should use this as a secure string. This was something that I whipped up pretty quick, so we can ignore that for right now. That is something that I would fix before submitting it into somebody's actual GitHub repository. This is another section right here where if you are using something within like a test environment or an environment that doesn't have certificates, you can basically ignore those errors. This is another thing that I found somebody else created. I copied and pasted and use it in my script here. It's pretty much this entire section there. So, for home lab usage, you're probably going to want to get pretty comfortable copying and pasting that into some of your functions. Then we can handle some of the authentication or setting up the authorization there. So we have the username and password, which is what we used up above. And then what happens if you use the credentials? So I've got some logic based around that. Kind of specifying out what happens if you use the credential. You've got to then pull out get network credential, and then specify the password property. And then specify out, hey, if you didn't use, because I didn't say that it was mandatory to use username and password or credential, I also built in an else statement, which I didn't actually have it terminate. So that's bad coding right there on my part. If there's no authentication parameters found, it should exit and not continue forward like it's doing right here.
Can you just say break in PowerShell?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, you can, or return. So then we've got our header information here. This is exactly what we set up above. So same process there. We've got our authentication piece here. So we're doing our auth there, then converting that over to our token, and then finally doing our web request to pull back the information on the hosts. And then if you really wanted to do this within your environment and you wanted this to set up a non-persistent token, this is again another kind of coding fail on my part. I didn't actually then disconnect the session. So if you look in your vCenter server and look at the sessions, you will still see this as a logged in session until it times out and gets kicked out. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind. So with that, let's go through here. I will copy that. And I'm just going to open up a new PowerShell window here, just so that we're not, again, I'm not cheating. There's no smoke and mirrors here. Then we can do, I just copied, pasted that into a brand new PowerShell window. You can do a get VM host rest. And we can do our vCenter server. This is going to be vcsa01.corp.local, and do username, which is going to be administrator at vSphere.local, and our password is the always famous VMware 1 asterisk or VMware 1 bang. We can run that. And then just like that, we're now using a PowerShell function to now make these RESTful API calls on the back end, and then return the output and make it all pretty like. There is another really good resource that a community member, Justin, has just put out into the wild that I will point out, which is another really good kind of resource to take a look at. This is also a really good way on my behalf to show off the, here we go. So again, a little nicety on my part. The SDK for REST that VMware has put out for vSphere itself. So this is everything that's dealing with this RESTful API. These are open sourced. So these are freely available out on GitHub. You can download everything that you would need to start interacting with the RESTful API. You can create issues, you can create pull requests, you can do all kinds of things. And Justin here went through and saw a need for some PowerShell samples. So he has actually submitted what he's calling PowerRest CLI. So here's the module file there. And then we're starting to see the scripts or the PS1s that are instantiating the functions. So we can see usage of like the vCenter variable. So this is doing the authentication piece. So he's setting this up so you have to run this very similar to like what you would do connect to VI server. And then setting your VMware API session ID token as a global variable so that it can be called. Then again, with some of the with any of the future requests, here's what happens if you need to ignore SSL certificates within your environment. He's got that included in there. Setting up the headers. So again, all stuff that we've done, we've talked about, and we've covered tonight. Then here is setting up a new session. So he created a function here that's new RVI session. So this looks very similar to everything that we've done so far tonight. And then down below that, we should start actually pulling back information. So this one right here is get RVM, or get REST VM. So doing the invoke web request against the global variable of vCenter. So then REST, then vCenter, then VM, and then doing a get using that global session variable to then feed into the headers. And then he's even taking it a step further, and he's formatting the output there so that instead of seeing this, much larger or I don't know, basically not seeing the way that it's basically spit out in how it's been coded into the API itself, but then kind of formatting it in a way that that is kind of more noticeable for users, more readable, I should say. So spitting that kind of information out. Let's see, what else does he have in here? Anyway, so this is another good resource. I'll copy this into it because it doesn't look like it's actually been accepted into the SDK quite yet. So that's another kind of cool thing that you can go through, look at, compare what you're writing to what Justin's written, or even just take what he's written and provide it to the community and start making use of it to then create additional resources. Like I didn't see a VM host, or a get our VM host. So you could make your own and then submit that on top of what he's already provided, and kind of a community, enhancing the community, making everybody better kind of scenario. So with that is all I prepared for tonight. I think we're doing pretty much right on time too. So that's even a little more impressive.
On the nose. You did this on purpose, didn't you? You have a stopwatch and everything.
I'm all professional.
I knows what I'm doing. All right. So let's see. Let me double check everything. Graham says he looks almost professional. Oh, thanks, Graham. So yeah. Nice. Wait, what? Double check Twitter real fast. No, we are clear for questions, sir. Thank you very much. That was awesome.
Fantastic.
I learned a ton of new stuff tonight. I can't wait to immediately apply it on this data center migration I'm working on during the day.
Ooh, fancy.
Yeah, fancy stuff. Cool. All right. A couple of responses. Excellent session. Thank you very much. Job well done, Kyle. My brain will hurt after all of these sessions. Cool. Awesome, dude. Well, thank you very much. And thanks everybody for attending. Have a great time.